Hello, students. Professor Sexton here with our video lecture on Robert Browning's My Last Duchess and Charles Bukowski's The Japanese Wife. So let me begin with My Last Duchess. I am not going to go over the entire poem, but there are just some important things that I want to point out about the poem. And so I am bringing it up now. You should be able to see it on the screen. So let me tell you a little background information about My Last Duchess. My Last Duchess is a poem known as a dramatic monologue. What a dramatic monologue is when a poet writes in the persona of someone else, oftentimes a historical figure. And the poem is spoken from that person's perspective. So even though in My Last Duchess, the poet is Robert Browning, this is not Robert Browning speaking. The person speaking in this poem is the Duke. It is a rather long poem coming in at 56 lines. And as I said before, I'm not going to go over every single part of the poem, but I just want to set some context for the poem. So in this poem, My Last Duchess, this is the setting. The Duke is showing a painting of his late wife, or his last wife, the Duchess, to this other person. And in the 56 lines of the poem, the only person that you hear speaking in the poem is the Duke. So you never actually hear the person to whom he is speaking. That person never says anything. But the thing that you have to always remember that there is someone else listening. And so let's look at some of the key parts of the poem. And so I'll just begin with the beginning. So in the beginning, the Duke is saying to this person, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive." And let's stop for that line too, looking as if she were alive. There are two possible interpretations there. One interpretation is that the painting is so lifelike that in the painting itself, it looks like she is alive. So it just means how well that the painter was able to capture the Duchess in that painting. But also, looking as if she were alive can give the indication that this Duchess is now dead. And that's why she's called My Last Duchess. The poem doesn't specify one way or the other on how we are to read this. So both of those possibilities are there. And Browning does this deliberately. He wants us to have both of these possible interpretations because that adds to this perspective of the Duke that we see in here. Then what the Duke starts to do is he starts to talk about the painter. And so the painter is the painter named Fry Pandolf. And so he's the man who painted this picture of his last Duchess. And here in line 4 and 5 is when you hear the Duke speak to the person he's showing the painting there. And notice he says, "Will it please you sit and look at her?" Now notice that there's a question mark there, and that question mark makes it seem as if he's asking this person to sit down. But once you know the Duke a little bit better, you'll understand that he's not so much asking this person to sit down as much as he's telling the person to sit down. And then he starts to talk about the painting and how well Fry Pandolf captures his Duchess. But one of the things that he focused on in this painting is a blush on the Duchess cheek. And so you see this in line 14 to 15, called that spot of joy into the Duchess cheek. And just know she's blushing in it. And this is the thing that the Duke focuses on. And then I want to backtrack just a little bit too. If you look at lines 9 and line 10, where he says, "But to myself thou turn," and then you have in parentheses, "since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I." So what that means is that this painting of his last Duchess is behind the curtain. And the only person who pulls the curtain back to allow people to see this painting is the Duke himself. And that's what he's saying. So he emphasizes this to the person that he's showing the painting to. And then he goes back to talk about the blush that is on his Duchess face. And you can tell that he's bothered by this because he's trying to explain and trying to understand what caused her to blush. But you see, it's more than just the blush. It speaks to his jealousy because on lines 21, starting on line 21, the Duke says, "She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere." And so you begin to really now understand what is at the heart of this Duke's issue here is that his last Duchess just was easily impressed with everything. And there's a sense of jealousy uh, in him that she would do that. And so what he does after that is he gives a few lines and examples of, scenarios where she was pleased with something. And then he indicates in line 31 that she might have been unfaithful when he says, "She thanked men good, but thanked somehow, I know not how." And so there's almost an indication there that perhaps that she had been unfaithful. Now we don't know this, and the issue is we never get the Duchess perspective. So everything that we hear, we're hearing from the Duke, and then we also get a sense of why he is so arrogant. He says, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. And so what that tells us is that the Duke comes from a long, prestigious family, 900 years. And he has the sense that the Duchess should only show attraction to him and to no one else. So that also speaks to his jealousy. But then what really becomes interesting around lines 34 is what he says, who stooped to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one, and said just this or that, and you discuss me. Here you miss, or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be less than so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse. Even though will be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. This line, these lines are so important because what he's essentially saying here is that he didn't have the skill in speech to let the Duchess know that he was displeased by her actions. And it indicates that he just expected her to know that this is how he wanted her to behave. But he never tells her this is how he wants her to behave. Yet I also find this very contradictory because he says that he doesn't have the skill in speech to let his will be known, yet to this messenger, he's letting his will be known. So there's a contradiction there. And then these lines here become interesting, where he says, "Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive." These lines are very interesting because what we hear here is that the Duke finally gives commands. But what's really interesting here is, to whom does he give the commands? Does he give the commands to her, or does he give the commands to someone else? And think about this. If he said just a few lines earlier that he was not able to tell her how he felt and what disappointed him or what disgusted him in her, then it would seem to imply that he didn't give commands to her, but he gave commands to someone else. And then he says, then all smiles stopped. So what does that mean? And once again, there's two possible interpretations here. It could be that, she was told that he didn't want her smiling at anyone else, and then she just stopped smiling. And so maybe psychologically she died inside. Yet, there's also the slight possibility that maybe he had her killed. Because look at this. After he says, then all smiles stop together, he repeats that line, there she stands as if alive. So remember, he had already told us that in the very beginning when he started to show the painting. There she was as if she were alive, and now here he repeats that as if she were alive. So it's quite conceivable that the reason why the smile stopped is because he had her killed. It's a possibility there. And once again, it's one of those things that Browning does in the poem to kind of leave both interpretations open. The last part of the poem is very interesting. And like the first few years that I read this poem, I used to ignore the first part, the last part of the poem. But then as I started to deal with the poem a little bit more, I realized how important these were. So let me just read the last lines. We'll meet the company below then, I'll repeat. But count your master's known magnificence as ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I vow as starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go together down, sir. Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which clouds of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. This last part is important because now it tells you who this other person is in the poem. So this other person in the poem is a servant for a count. The count has a daughter. And so what the Duke is trying to do, the Duke is now in negotiations for his next wife. That's what a dowry is. A dowry is money that he will pay to the count for his daughter's hands in marriage. And so the Duke is now in negotiation for his next Duchess. And it's interesting that he shares this information about the last Duchess, not with the Count and not with the daughter that he's hoping to marry, but with a servant of the Count. So I mean, there's three degrees of separation here between the person that he wants to marry and the person that he's told all this information about. So it gives you the impression that this new young girl is not going to hear this information at all. And in many ways, she's going to fall into a similar situation like the last Duchess because she won't know how he's expecting her to behave. So it's almost setting her up. And then this last part, these last three lines are very important. So where he says, notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which clouds of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So in the poem, he ends with another object. And this object is a sculpture. But notice that in the sculpture is Neptune, god of the sea, who is taming a seahorse. And you'll have to ask yourself, what does this last scene in the poem have to do with everything else that is there? I mean, so how do you draw a parallel between the Neptune and are we supposed to draw a parallel between Neptune and the Duke? And who's the seahorse? And what does it mean, the taming the seahorse? Then also, there are questions about how the Duke looks at people as object. Because notice here, when he says, though his fair daughter Seth, as I avowed is starting, is my object. The painting itself is an object. This sculpture is an object. The last Duchess is an object. And this new future Duchess is perhaps an object as well. And so you look at the poem all together to get this perspective of this Duke's personality and what's going on in his head. This is a poem that you'll need to read and sit with for a bit to kind of work out what you think is going on in it. And as I said before, there are multiple interpretations to key lines. And that doesn't mean that one interpretation is right or one interpretation is wrong. It just works on how well you work to prove the interpretation that you have of the poem. So I'm going to stop sharing this one, and then I'm going to move to the second poem, The Japanese Wife. This is a poem by Charles Bukowski, and it's a much later poem than the one about my last Duchess. This one is also long, not as long. It comes in at 40 pages. I'm sorry, 40 lines. And the main reason I'm using this one is I thought it was a good comparison poem. to my last Duchess, because in a lot of ways it kind of deals with the same type of topic. You have a husband here reflecting on his wife, and this too is a wife who is no longer living. So I'll bring this poem up, and I am going to read this poem in its entirety, and then just talk about it briefly. So here's how the poem began. "O Lord," he said, "Japanese women, real women, they have not forgotten bowing and smiling, closing the wounds men have made. But American women will kill you like they tear a lampshade. American women care less than a dime. They've gotten derailed. They're too nervous to make good, always scowling, belly aching, disillusioned, overwrought. But oh Lord," said the Japanese woman, "there was this one." And let's just stop here for a moment. So you have this speaker here who is beginning by comparing Japanese women to American women. And in these first 11 lines, he gives this impression that Japanese women are more submissive and more forgiving than American women, because he says that American women will kill you like they tear a lampshade, whereas he says that Japanese women um, are real women. They have not forgotten bowing and smiling and closing the wounds men have made. However, this part somewhat contradicts with the second part, because in lines starting with line 13, the speaker said, "There was this one. I came home and the door was locked, and when I broke in, she broke out the bread knife and chased me under the bed, and her sister came, and they kept me under the bed for 2 days. And when I came out at last, she didn't mention attorneys, just said, 'You will never wrong me again.' And I didn't." So let's just stop there. So this second part of the poem contrasts with what he said in the first part, because in the first part, he gave the impression that Japanese women were very submissive and wouldn't kill you. But then here we have a scene with a Japanese wife, with she and her sister, who chased him underneath the bed with a bread knife and kept him there for 2 days. And it's an interesting poem because nowhere in the poem does it say that they're married. However, there are two giveaways. First of all, you have the title of the poem, which is called The Japanese Wife. And then you have this line 20 where she didn't mention attorneys. So it's kind of like the sense that she wasn't going to seek a divorce. There are some mysteries about this poem and some things that we don't understand, because she said, "You would never wrong me again." And it's interesting that he didn't. But then let's read the third part of it. "But then she died on me, and dying said, 'You can wrong me now,' and I did." This is really interesting to me, these three lines of it, because she told him when she was living that he would never wrong her again, and he didn't. But then she died on him, and when she was dying, she said, "You can wrong me now," and he did. And one of the questions that I ask myself is, how does he wrong her in her death? And once again, this is not one of those questions that is answered in the poem. And so this is one of those points of analysis. This is one of those things that you have to do when you're looking at the poem to try to figure out what's going on here, because he doesn't make this clear. Perhaps, and the poem doesn't specify this, but perhaps the way that he wronged her is by cheating on her. And if that is it, then it's interesting that it's still considering cheating on her even after she's dead. Um, but what's also interesting is to look at how he felt, because starting with line 25, he says, "But you know, I felt worse then than when she was living. There was no voice, no knife, nothing but little Japanese prints on the wall. All of those tiny people sitting by red rivers with flying green birds. And I took them down and put them face down in a drawer with my shirts. And it was the first time I realized that she was dead, even though I buried her." So let's stop here. So he admits that he wronged her in her death. Um, and even though she's dead, he feels worse about wronging her in her death, even though there was no voice or no knife. But then he switched and he talks about these Japanese prints on the wall. So once again, we're talking about paintings. And these paintings apparently are very important to him. And what the poem doesn't tell us is what they represent to him. But perhaps we can see in some ways they represent his wife and what she means to him. And it's interesting that he has to take them down because for some reason, for them being on the wall, they serve as a reminder of her and perhaps a reminder of what he did to her. And so he takes them down. And notice that when he puts them in his drawer, it's not that he just puts them in the drawer, he also puts them in the drawer face down. Like, so it's a double way of trying to hide that. Um, and then he says when he did that, that was the first time that he realized that she was dead, even though he buried her. And that doesn't mean that he physically buried her. It just means that he was at the cemetery and he's the one who was there when she was laid to rest. But then the interesting thing is the way that the poem ends. And he says, and someday I'll take them out, all out again, all the tan-faced little people sitting happily by their bridges at huts and mountains, but not right now, not just yet. And so the ending is very interesting because once again, this is a reflection on his relationship with his wife. But the thing that I find very interesting about this poem and intriguing is that you look at the way that the poem starts off, where he talks about Japanese women and how Japanese women being very different than American women, but then how the Japanese wife that he has seems to be very much like the American women that he describes. And so this is how we begin. But then by the time I get to the ending of this poem, I find it hard to see that connection to the first part. And that's not a fault in the poem. I think this is something that Bukowski is doing. And so the questions that I ask myself when I come to this poem is what is going on in the husband's mindset as he reflects on not only the relationship with his wife, but also the memory of his wife. And let me just end by saying this with poetry. Poetry can be frustrating in a lot of ways. And the reason why I said that it can be frustrating is that if you're used to reading something and you have a definite answer where, you know, it tells you that this is how you should read this and this is what is happening, poetry doesn't often give you that luxury. It presents scenes. It often gives you two ways of reading a work. And so what becomes important in a lot of ways is your interpretation and your analysis. And what you will have to do is kind of like look at lines, look at poetic language, like diction and figurative language and senses, and ask yourself a lot of questions of the literary work of the poem to try to get at what it is that you think this poem means. When you're writing your paper on poetry, do not be obsessed with getting the right answer. That's not what I want you to do. What I want you to do is to look at a literary interpretation, and I want you to give evidence for your literary interpretation. Because as readers of poems, we can all come to poems with a different interpretation. And so I won't necessarily read the poem the same way that you would read the poem. And you can read a poem at one age and read it much later and read it at different ages. And at different times in your life, that poem will mean different things to you. I mean, there are poems that I read when I was 15 that I read differently when I was 25, that I read differently now that I'm 50. And I suspect that when I'm 60 and I return to some of those poems, I will read them differently once again. And that's totally fine. Um, that is the beauty of poetry, that it allows for that. There's going to be one more video lecture, and this third video lecture is just going to be about your first paper assignment. I will end this one, and I will see you for the last final lecture.